Sometimes the people we least expect hold the most power. In a world where titles define worth, one woman's quiet dignity would change everything. In the marble halls of Grand Belmont Hotel, CEO Maurice Langston rules with an iron fist. But when he tries to fire Delores, a maid, in front of his board, he makes a mistake. Delores isn't just any employee. She's worked these halls for 30 years and knows secrets that built this empire. When she raises one finger and silences the most powerful man in the room, everything changes. What follows is a reckoning that exposes truths about legacy, respect, and wisdom found in unexpected places. But what could a maid know that would make a ruthless CEO beg her to stay? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Grand Belmont Hotel stood like a monument to American ambition on Fifth Avenue. Its limestone facade catching the morning light in ways that made passers-by pause and look up. 37 floors of luxury rose into the Manhattan sky, each window reflecting the dreams and struggles of a nation that still believed in the possibility of transformation. In the lobby, beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of history, hung a portrait that most guests walked past without a second glance. The Belmont family portrait, painted in 1952, showed 3 generations gathered around the hotel's original blueprints. Their faces carried the determined optimism of post-war America, hands clasped in unity, eyes bright with the vision of building something lasting. Maurice Langston had walked past that portrait every morning for 15 years without truly seeing it. At 58, he commanded the 32nd floor corner office with the kind of authority that made subordinates check their watches and straighten their ties before entering his presence. His success story was the kind that business magazines loved to feature. A young man from Detroit's East Side who had worked his way up from night auditor to chief executive, transforming the Grand Belmont from a respectable hotel into a luxury empire spanning 12 cities. But success, Maurice had learned, was a demanding master. It required sacrifices that seemed reasonable at the time, decisions that felt necessary in the moment, and a hardening of the heart that happened so gradually you barely noticed until it was complete. The man who had once worked double shifts to pay for business school had evolved into someone who measured every interaction by its return on investment. The boardroom on the 32nd floor reflected this evolution perfectly. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of Central Park, while the Brazilian rosewood table could seat 24 executives in leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, 12 of those chairs held the senior leadership team that had helped Maurice build his empire. There was Margaret Chen, his chief financial officer, whose spreadsheets could find inefficiencies in a Swiss watch. Next to her sat David Rodriguez, head of operations, a man who had revolutionized their housekeeping protocols and reduced costs by 18% over 2 years. The rest of the team represented departments spanning from marketing to legal, each chosen for their ability to deliver results without sentiment. 3 floors below, in the service corridors that guests never saw, Delores Washington was beginning her day as she had for the past 30 years. At 62, she moved through the hotel's back passages with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every shortcut, every hiding place, every secret the building held. Her uniform was always pressed, her gray hair always neat beneath the regulation cap. Her manner always professional, even when dealing with the most difficult situations. Delores had started at the Grand Belmont when she was 32, a single mother, desperate for steady work that offered health insurance for her daughter. The hotel industry wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and the Belmont family had treated their employees with a respect that was becoming increasingly rare in the business world. She remembered her first day vividly. How nervous she had been walking into the pristine marble lobby. Mrs. Elizabeth Belmont herself had conducted the interview, insisting that every employee, regardless of position, was integral to the hotel's reputation. "Delores," she had said, "our guests judge us not just by the thread count of our sheets, but by the kindness in our voices and the pride in our work. Never forget that you represent something larger than yourself here." Those words had stayed with Delores through 3 decades of service, through economic downturns and ownership changes, through the gradual corporatization of what had once been a family business. She had watched the Belmont children grow up in these halls, had comforted them through scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks, had been invited to their graduations and weddings when they moved on to build their own lives. The transition to corporate ownership 5 years ago had brought changes that Delores felt in her bones. The new management company, led by Maurice Langston, spoke in terms of efficiency metrics and cost optimization. The personal touches that had made the Grand Belmont special, the handwritten welcome notes, the complimentary afternoon tea for regular guests, the staff who remembered names and preferences, these began disappearing in favor of standardized procedures and digital check-ins. Delores had adapted because she understood that businesses needed to evolve to survive. But she also remembered what the hotel had been, what it could be again if someone cared enough to preserve its soul alongside its profits. She kept that knowledge carefully, like a gardener tending seeds through a harsh winter, waiting for the right season to plant them again. The morning routine brought its familiar rhythms. Delores checked the supply closets, coordinated with the housekeeping supervisors, and made her rounds through the guest floors. She had trained herself to see what others missed: the slightly frayed carpet that would trip an elderly guest, the loose door handle that would frustrate a businessman in a hurry, the burned-out light bulb that would cast unwelcome shadows in a romantic alcove. Her attention to detail had earned her recognition over the years, though recognition in the hotel business often came in the form of additional responsibilities rather than additional pay. She had trained dozens of new employees, had been asked to troubleshoot problems that stumped management, had saved the hotel from numerous potential disasters through her vigilance and experience. The other staff members looked to Delores with a respect that transcended the hotel's formal hierarchy. Rosa, the young housekeeper from Guatemala, sought her advice on everything from cleaning techniques to dealing with difficult guests. James, the veteran bellhop, trusted her judgment when guests made unusual requests. Even the kitchen staff consulted her when planning special events, knowing that her 3 decades of experience had shown her what worked and what didn't. This informal network of respect and consultation had developed naturally over the years, but it operated largely invisible to the executive level. Maurice and his team saw only the surface metrics: rooms cleaned per hour, guest satisfaction scores, cost per occupied room. They didn't see the small acts of kindness that turned first-time visitors into loyal customers, the extra efforts that prevented small problems from becoming major complaints, the institutional knowledge that kept the hotel running smoothly despite constant corporate reorganizations. As Delores made her way through the morning routine, she noticed details that would have escaped a casual observer. The marble floors in the lobby needed a deeper cleaning than the standard schedule provided. The flower arrangements in the elevators were beginning to wilt, creating an impression of neglect that contradicted the hotel's luxury positioning. The coffee service in the business center was running low earlier each day, suggesting either increased demand or inadequate planning. These observations went into the mental ledger Delores had been keeping for 30 years, a comprehensive understanding of the hotel's rhythms and needs that no computer system could replicate. She had tried, on several occasions, to share these insights with management, but the corporate structure didn't have mechanisms for upward communication from housekeeping staff. Suggestions went into a digital suggestion box that seemed to function more as a psychological pressure valve than an actual source of operational improvement. The irony wasn't lost on Delores that the people who knew the hotel most intimately, who could predict guest needs, prevent maintenance issues, and identify cost-saving opportunities were the same people whose positions were most vulnerable when budgets tightened. She had watched too many experienced colleagues disappear during efficiency drives, their decades of knowledge walking out the door to be replaced by cheaper, less experienced workers who would need months to learn what the veterans had known instinctively. This morning felt different, though. There was something in the air, a tension that experienced hotel workers learned to recognize. Maurice had called an all-hands meeting for the department heads, and rumors were circulating about budget cuts and restructuring. Delores had seen this pattern before. New management would arrive with promises of innovation and growth, squeeze out costs wherever possible, then move on to their next challenge, leaving the staff to deal with the long-term consequences. As she organized her cleaning cart for the morning rounds, Delores reflected on the changes she had witnessed, not just in the hotel, but in the broader world of work. The old social contract, loyalty in exchange for security, respect for experience, recognition of human dignity regardless of job, title, seemed to be crumbling in favor of a more transactional approach that reduced employees to line items on a spreadsheet. Yet she also remembered what was possible when leadership understood that true luxury came not from expensive fixtures but from genuine care. The Grand Belmont had once been a place where employees took pride in their work because they felt valued and respected, where guests returned year after year because they felt genuinely welcomed, where the business thrived because everyone understood they were part of something larger than themselves. That vision wasn't naive nostalgia. It was a proven business model that had built the hotel's reputation over decades. The question was whether anyone in the current leadership had the wisdom to recognize its value before it was lost forever. As Delores prepared to begin her rounds, she caught sight of her reflection in the service elevator's polished steel doors. 62 years old, 30 years of service, countless small victories and daily kindnesses, and still here, still caring, still hoping that dignity and respect might prevail over mere efficiency. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her cap, and stepped into the elevator, ready for whatever this day might bring. The Grand Belmont Hotel would continue its operations. Its guests would come and go. Its profits would be counted and reported. But beneath the surface of corporate metrics and quarterly reports, deeper currents were stirring, currents that would soon bring long-buried truths to the surface and force everyone to confront the real cost of forgetting where they came from. The quarterly board meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp, as Maurice Langston's meetings always did. Punctuality was one of many disciplines he had imposed upon the Grand Belmont's culture, along with quarterly profit targets that seemed to grow more ambitious each year. The 12 executives seated around the Brazilian rosewood table represented the finest business minds money could hire, each armed with tablets displaying charts and graphs that reduced the hotel's operation to measurable data points. Maurice stood at the head of the table, his navy suit impeccable, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence commanding the room's attention without effort. Behind him, a wall-mounted screen displayed the third quarter results in stark black and red numbers. Revenue was up 4% year over year, but operating costs had risen 6%, creating the kind of margin compression that made investors nervous and executives search for solutions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maurice began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we face a fundamental challenge. Our costs are growing faster than our revenue, and that trend cannot continue if we want to maintain our competitive position." Margaret Chen, the chief financial officer, touched her tablet and brought up detailed cost breakdowns. "The largest increase is in labor costs," she reported. "Health insurance premiums are up 12%. And our average employee tenure means we're paying higher salaries than comparable properties that maintain more turnover." David Rodriguez, head of operations, nodded in agreement. "Our employee loyalty is actually working against us financially. Long-term staff command higher wages, but don't necessarily deliver proportionally higher productivity. A younger workforce would be more cost-effective and potentially more adaptable to new systems. Maurice listened to the familiar analysis with growing satisfaction. This was the kind of clear-eyed business thinking that had built his reputation. While other executives might hesitate to make difficult decisions, he had always been willing to do what needed to be done, regardless of sentiment or tradition. "I've prepared a restructuring plan that will address this issue," Maurice announced, retrieving a stack of documents from his briefcase. Each folder contained termination letters he had drafted personally, choosing employees whose departure would create the greatest cost savings with minimal disruption to operations. The letters were clinical in their efficiency, citing organizational restructuring and economic necessity rather than acknowledging the human cost of these decisions. The first letter bore the name of Thomas Anderson, a maintenance supervisor who had worked at the hotel for 23 years. His institutional knowledge of the building systems was extensive, but his salary reflected his experience, and a younger technician could handle most of his responsibilities for 40% less cost. The second letter targeted Carmen Rodriguez, a front desk supervisor whose bilingual skills and customer service expertise had earned her recognition from hotel industry publications. But recognition didn't translate directly to profit margins, and her position could be restructured to utilize less expensive staff. The third letter carried the name Delores Washington. Maurice had given considerable thought to Dolores's position. As a housekeeper with 30 years of tenure, she represented exactly the kind of cost inefficiency that needed to be eliminated. Her salary was nearly double that of newer staff, and while she had a reputation for reliability, housekeeping was ultimately an entry-level position that didn't require decades of experience to perform adequately. More importantly, Delores had become something of an informal leader among the service staff, and Maurice had observed that such influence could be problematic during periods of change. Employees looked to her for guidance and reassurance, creating an unofficial power structure that competed with official management channels. Removing her would send a clear message about who controlled the hotel's direction, while eliminating a potential source of resistance to future changes. "The terminations will be effective immediately," Maurice continued, distributing copies of the restructuring plan to the board members. "We'll provide standard severance packages and positive references, but these positions need to be eliminated to restore our cost structure to competitive levels." The board members reviewed the documents with the detached efficiency of people who had made similar decisions countless times before. These were not personal choices but business necessities, the kind of tough decisions that separated successful executives from those who let sentiment cloud their judgment. Margaret Chen raised a practical concern. Some of these employees have significant institutional knowledge. Are we confident that their replacements can maintain service levels during the transition? Service levels are maintained through systems and procedures, not individual personalities, Maurice replied. We have detailed protocols for every position, and properly trained staff can deliver consistent results, regardless of their tenure. Sentimentality about long-term employees is a luxury we can't afford in today's market. David Rodriguez added his support. Maurice is right. We've become too dependent on specific individuals rather than building scalable processes. This restructuring will force us to strengthen our systems and reduce our vulnerability to employee-specific knowledge. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, addressing logistics and implementation details with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled corporate machine. No one questioned the fundamental morality of the decisions, because in their world, quarterly results provided all the moral justification necessary. Shareholders expected returns, investors demanded efficiency, and executives who delivered both were rewarded with bonuses and promotions. As the meeting concluded, Maurice felt the familiar satisfaction of decisive leadership. While other executives might agonize over such decisions, he had learned to make them quickly and move forward without second-guessing. The hotel industry was competitive and unforgiving, and success required the ability to make difficult choices without emotional interference. "I'll handle the terminations personally," Maurice announced as the board members gathered their materials. "Clean, professional, and immediate. We'll have this resolved before lunch." The first two terminations proceeded exactly as Maurice had planned. Thomas Anderson accepted his termination with quiet dignity, thanking Maurice for the opportunity to work at the Grand Belmont and expressing hope that his replacement would maintain the hotel's high standards. Carmen Rodriguez was more emotional, but ultimately professional, gathering her personal belongings and saying goodbye to colleagues without creating any dramatic scenes. By 11:30, Maurice was ready for the final termination. He instructed his assistant to summon Delores Washington to the boardroom, where several board members remained to handle other agenda items. Having witnesses present would make the termination more official and reduce the possibility of any misunderstandings about the decision's finality. Delores arrived within minutes, her housekeeping cart temporarily abandoned in the service corridor. She entered the boardroom with the quiet composure that had characterized her work for 3 decades, showing no obvious nervousness despite the unusual nature of the summons. Her presence in the executive boardroom created a subtle but noticeable contrast. Her simple uniform and practical shoes among the tailored suits and Italian leather, her calloused hands and graying hair among the manicured appearances of corporate success. Maurice remained standing, the termination letter in his hand, the familiar script of corporate efficiency ready to unfold. This was just business, he reminded himself, just another necessary decision in the ongoing challenge of managing a complex organization. Personal feelings had no place in such moments. "Delores," he began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for all personnel matters. "Your position is being eliminated as part of an organizational restructuring. Your employment with the Grand Belmont Hotel is terminated effective immediately." He extended the termination letter toward her, expecting the same resigned acceptance he had received from the previous 2 employees. The letter contained all the standard language about severance pay and continuing health insurance, the legal protection and corporate courtesy that made such moments tolerable for everyone involved. But instead of reaching for the letter, Delores did something unexpected. She raised her right hand, index finger extended, in a simple gesture that somehow commanded immediate attention. The movement was so deliberate, so dignified, so utterly calm that it created a moment of complete silence in the room. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to fill the entire boardroom. "No, Mr. Langston, I don't think that's going to happen today." The 12 people in that room, 11 executives and 1 housekeeper, found themselves frozen in a moment that would be remembered by each of them for the rest of their lives. Maurice stood with the termination letter still extended, his mouth slightly open, his carefully planned script suddenly forgotten. The board members stopped their side conversations and turned their full attention to the unexpected drama unfolding before them. Delores had not raised her voice, had not made any threatening gestures, had not violated any protocol or procedure. She had simply said no, with such quiet conviction that it transformed the entire dynamic of the room. In that single word, and in the raised finger that preceded it, lay 30 years of dignity, wisdom, and accumulated respect that could not be dismissed with a corporate termination letter. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, each person in the room grappling with the unprecedented nature of what had just occurred. Maurice had conducted hundreds of terminations throughout his career, but none had ever been met with such calm, absolute refusal. Maurice felt his face flush with heat as the seconds ticked by in unprecedented silence. In 30 years of business, no employee had ever simply refused termination. The very concept violated everything he understood about corporate hierarchy and executive authority. His hand remained extended with the termination letter, Trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Delores," he said, his voice tight with forced control, "I don't think you understand the situation. This is not a discussion or a negotiation. Your employment has been terminated. Security will escort you from the building if necessary." But Delores remained perfectly still, her finger now lowered, but her posture unchanged, calm, dignified, completely unintimidated by the threat of security or the corporate power arrayed before her. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and withdrew something that caught the light from the conference room's crystal chandeliers. It was a key, not the modern plastic cards that most hotel employees carried, but an actual brass key, worn smooth by decades of handling. The metal had developed a patina that spoke of countless uses, and it hung from a simple chain that suggested it had been treasured rather than simply carried. "This key," Delores said, holding it up so everyone in the room could see, "was given to me by Mrs. Elizabeth Belmont herself on my first day of work 30 years ago. It opens every door in this hotel: guest rooms, storage areas, executive offices, even the safe in the basement that holds the original property deeds." She paused, letting the significance of that statement settle over the room. Several board members leaned forward, their attention now completely focused on this unexpected development. Maurice's termination letter seemed suddenly less important than the small brass key that represented access and trust beyond anything they had imagined. "Mrs. Belmont told me," Delores continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone sharing sacred knowledge, "that this key was a symbol of responsibility. She said the person who carried it would be the guardian of the hotel's true purpose, the keeper of its soul when times got difficult and people forgot what this place was meant to be." Margaret Chen, the chief financial officer, spoke into the silence. "What exactly are you claiming, Mrs. Washington?" Delores turned to face her directly, her manner respectful but unwavering. "I'm not claiming anything, ma'am. I'm stating facts. I was hired personally by the Belmont family when this hotel was still a family business. I helped raise their children in these halls. I was trusted with responsibilities that went far beyond housekeeping because the Belmonts understood that a hotel's reputation depends on everyone who works here, not just the people in expensive suits." Maurice felt control of the situation slipping away and fought to regain it. "This is completely irrelevant," he declared, his voice louder than he intended. "Whatever arrangements you may have had with previous ownership, you're currently employed by Langston Hospitality Group, and your position has been eliminated." These historical anecdotes don't change current business realities, but David Rodriguez, head of operations, raised a hand to interrupt. "Actually, Maurice, I think we should hear what she has to say. If she has historical knowledge about the hotel's operations, it might be relevant to our decision-making process." Delores nodded appreciatively at David, then began to speak with the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting 30 years for this moment. "When I started here in 1993, little Sarah Belmont was 7 years old and her brother Michael was 9. Their parents worked long hours building this business, and often those children would come to the hotel after school. I became something like a second mother to them, helping with homework in the back office, bringing them dinner when their parents were in meetings, comforting them when they had nightmares during family trips." The board members found themselves drawn into this unexpected narrative, their business-focused minds struggling to process the human dimension that Delores was introducing to their sterile corporate environment. "Sarah had dyslexia," Delores continued, "and the schools weren't much help back then. I spent hours with that child, finding ways to help her read and write. I discovered she was brilliant with numbers and spatial relationships, just needed different approaches than traditional teaching provided. Today, she's one of the most successful architects in California, designing sustainable buildings that win international awards." Maurice shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this personal history was somehow undermining his authority, but unable to articulate exactly how. "This is very touching," he said with barely concealed sarcasm, "but we're not running a daycare center. We're operating a business that needs to remain profitable, Delores turned to face him directly, her expression patient but firm. "Mr. Langston, with respect, you don't understand what business we're really in. You think we're selling rooms and room service and conference facilities. But the Belmont family understood that we're actually selling experiences, memories, and trust. The business succeeded because employees felt valued and guests felt genuinely welcomed." She reached into another pocket and withdrew a small photograph, faded with age, but still clear enough to make out the figures in it. The image showed a younger Delores standing next to a Christmas tree, in what was recognizably the hotel lobby, surrounded by the Belmont family and several other employees. Everyone in the picture was smiling genuinely, and there was an unmistakable warmth to the scene that contrasted sharply with the corporate efficiency of the current boardroom. "This was taken during our 1998 Christmas party," Delores explained, passing the photograph around the table. "Mrs. Belmont insisted on having it in the main lobby so guests could see that we were a real family, not just employees following scripts. That year, we had record occupancy rates and the highest guest satisfaction scores in the hotel's history." Margaret Chen studied the photograph carefully before passing it to the next board member. "What specific role did you play in the hotel's operations beyond housekeeping?" Delores smiled for the first time since entering the boardroom. "Ma'am, in a family business, everyone plays multiple roles. I coordinated with the kitchen for special dietary needs, worked with maintenance to prevent problems before they became complaints, trained new employees in the Belmont standards of service, and served as a liaison between management and staff when communication broke down." She paused, looking directly at Maurice. "I also consulted on major decisions because Mrs. Belmont valued experience and practical wisdom over theoretical business models. When they were considering the expansion into the adjoining building, I provided input based on traffic patterns and guest behaviors I had observed over years of service." David Rodriguez leaned forward with obvious interest. "What kind of input specifically?" "I recommended adding the private elevator between the executive suites and the restaurant because I had noticed that high-profile guests often wanted discreet access for business meals. I suggested the current layout of the conference facilities because I understood how different types of events required different spatial arrangements. I proposed the family suites with connecting rooms because I had seen too many traveling families struggling with inadequate accommodations." The board members exchanged glances as they began to realize that Delores possessed operational knowledge that could be valuable regardless of her official job title. Maurice watched this shift in attention with growing frustration, recognizing that his simple termination process was becoming complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. "These historical contributions," Maurice said, trying to regain control of the narrative, "don't address current operational needs. The hotel industry has evolved, and we need employees who can adapt to modern systems and procedures." Delores nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right that the industry has evolved, Mr. Langston, but some things don't change. Guests still want to feel valued and respected. Employees still perform better when they feel their contributions matter. And successful businesses still depend on people who understand that profit comes from excellence, not the other way around." The brass key caught the light again as Delores shifted it from one hand to the other, and several board members found their eyes drawn to this physical symbol of trust and responsibility that seemed to carry more authority than any corporate title or termination letter. In the growing silence of the boardroom, it was becoming clear that this unexpected confrontation was about more than just one employee's job security. It was about fundamentally different visions of what the Grand Belmont Hotel could be, and what it had been before corporate efficiency became the only measure of success. The silence in the boardroom stretched until Margaret Chen cleared her throat and spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to dealing with complex financial situations. "Mrs. Washington, you mentioned consulting on expansion decisions. Can you be more specific about your involvement in major capital investments? Delores reached into a third pocket of her uniform, a detail that made several board members realize they had never actually looked closely enough at hotel staff to notice how many practical features their clothing included. She withdrew a small notebook, its cover worn smooth from years of handling, filled with pages that had been written on, marked up, and referenced countless times. This contains my observations about the hotel's operations since 1993, she explained, opening the notebook to reveal neat handwriting that documented everything from seasonal occupancy patterns to guest complaint trends. When Mr. and Mrs. Belmont were considering major decisions, they often asked me to review these notes and provide recommendations based on what I had actually observed, rather than what theoretical models suggested. She flipped to a section marked with a paperclip and began reading specific entries. In 1999, when they were debating whether to add the business center, I recommended including small private meeting rooms rather than just computer stations. I had noticed that business travelers often needed to make confidential phone calls or hold impromptu meetings, but our only options were either completely public spaces or expensive conference rooms. David Rodriguez nodded slowly. That design has been incredibly successful. Those private meeting pods generate some of our highest per square foot revenue. In 2003, Delores continued, when they were renovating the restaurant, I suggested adding the semi-private dining alcoves with adjustable privacy screens. I had observed that many guests wanted the energy of the main dining room, but also needed to conduct business conversations without being overheard. Margaret Chen was taking notes now, her financial mind clearly recognizing the business value of these operational insights. What was your involvement in the 2007 expansion that added the spa and fitness facilities? Delores smiled with what might have been pride. That was actually my idea originally. I had been noticing that many of our long-term guests were traveling with personal trainers or requesting specific dietary accommodations that suggested health and wellness were becoming major concerns. I proposed that we could differentiate ourselves from other luxury hotels by integrating wellness services rather than just adding amenities. Maurice felt a growing sense of unease as he watched. His board members become increasingly engaged with Delores' narrative. This was not how employee terminations were supposed to proceed. The woman was supposed to accept her severance package and leave quietly, not demonstrate that she possessed strategic thinking capabilities that might exceed those of his paid consultants. Mrs. Washington, he interjected, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. While these anecdotes are interesting, they don't address the fundamental issue of cost efficiency. Your suggestions may have had merit 20 years ago, but current market conditions require different approaches. Delores closed her notebook and looked at Maurice with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Mr. Langston, may I ask how long you've been in the hotel industry? The question caught Maurice off guard because it seemed to reverse the power dynamic of the conversation. He was supposed to be asking the questions, not responding to them. I've been with Langston Hospitality Group for 15 years, and I had previous experience in corporate management before that. And how many of those years were spent working directly with guests or in operational positions? Maurice's jaw tightened as he realized where this line of questioning was leading. My expertise is in strategic management and financial optimization. I don't need to have worked as a bellhop to understand how to run a profitable hotel business. Of course not, Delores agreed quietly. But there's a difference between understanding the business and understanding the business. Strategy and finance are crucial, but they work best when they're built on a foundation of operational reality. She reopened her notebook and turned to a different section. For example, your recent decision to eliminate the evening turn-down service saved approximately $40,000 annually in labor costs. But it also resulted in a 12% decrease in guest satisfaction scores and a 15% reduction in repeat bookings from our highest value customers. Margaret Chen looked up sharply from her own notes. How do you know those statistics? That information isn't widely distributed. Dolores's expression remained calm. I listen, ma'am. Hotel staff hear everything. Guest complaints, employee concerns, management discussions in elevators. When you've been here as long as I have, you develop a comprehensive understanding of how different decisions affect the overall operation. She turned to another page in her notebook. The cost savings from eliminating turndown service were more than offset by the revenue loss from reduced customer loyalty. A guest who used to stay with us 12 times per year now stays 8 times per year and books the other 4 nights with competitors who still provide full-service amenities. David Rodriguez was studying his tablet intently, cross-referencing Dolores's claims with the data he had access to. After a few moments, he looked up with an expression of surprise. She's right. Our repeat customer rate has declined significantly since we made those operational changes. Maurice felt his authority being undermined with each revelation, but he was also beginning to recognize that Delores possessed knowledge that could be genuinely valuable to the hotel's success. The problem was that admitting this would require acknowledging that his termination decision had been premature and poorly informed. Delores seemed to sense his internal struggle and continued with gentle persistence. Mr. Langston, I'm not trying to embarrass you or challenge your authority. I'm trying to help you understand that this hotel's success has always depended on people who care about more than just quarterly results. She reached into yet another pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a folded blueprint, old paper that had been carefully preserved despite obvious handling over many years. As she unfolded it on the conference table, the board members could see that it was an original architectural drawing of the hotel, marked with handwritten notes and modifications. These are the original construction plans from 1952, Delores explained. Mrs. Belmont gave them to me in 2010, just before the family sold the business. She said they contained the hotel's DNA, all the design decisions that made it special, all the modifications that improved functionality, all the lessons learned from 30 years of operation. The blueprint was covered with annotations in different handwriting, showing where walls had been moved, where new electrical systems had been installed, where plumbing had been rerouted to improve efficiency. It was a document that told the story of the hotel's evolution through decades of thoughtful improvement rather than dramatic renovation. Margaret Chen leaned over to examine the blueprint more closely. This level of documentation is extraordinary. Most hotels lose this kind of institutional knowledge during ownership transitions. That's exactly why Mrs. Belmont entrusted it to me, Delores replied. She was worried that future owners might make changes without understanding the reasons behind the original design decisions. She wanted someone to preserve the knowledge of what worked and why it worked. Maurice stared at the blueprint and realized he was looking at information that his architects and consultants had never seen. Every major renovation project since his arrival had been based on current industry standards and theoretical best practices, without any reference to the specific lessons learned from this particular building's unique history. Why haven't you shared this information before? David Rodriguez asked. Delores folded the blueprint carefully before answering. I tried, sir. I submitted detailed reports after each major change, explaining what we might be losing and suggesting alternative approaches. But the corporate structure doesn't really have mechanisms for upward communication from housekeeping staff. She paused, looking around the room at faces that were beginning to show genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. Besides, most of the decisions had already been made by the time they were announced to staff. My role was to implement changes, not to question them. Maurice realized he was facing a situation that his business school training had never prepared him for. He had approached the hotel industry with the confidence of someone who understood universal management principles, but he was discovering that institutional knowledge and operational wisdom might be more valuable than his corporate expertise. The termination letter was still in his hand. But it no longer seemed like the decisive document he had intended it to be. Instead, it was beginning to feel like evidence of his own limitations, proof that he had been making decisions based on incomplete understanding of what he was actually managing. As the implications of Dolores's revelations settled over the boardroom, she reached into a final pocket and withdrew a photograph that was even more faded than the Christmas picture she had shared earlier. This image was smaller, more personal, and when she placed it on the conference table, Maurice felt his breath catch in his throat. The photograph showed a young man in an ill-fitting suit standing nervously in the Grand Belmont's lobby, flanked by an older black woman in a housekeeper's uniform and a distinguished white man in an expensive suit. The young man was clearly Maurice, though he looked almost unrecognizable, thinner, unsure of himself, with an expression of gratitude and hope that had long since been replaced by corporate confidence and executive authority. "This was taken on your first day of work here, Mr. Langston," Delores said gently. "September 15th, 2008. You were 28 years old, fresh out of business school, and desperate for a chance to prove yourself in the hospitality industry." Maurice stared at the photograph, memories flooding back that he had spent years trying to forget. He remembered that day vividly, how nervous he had been, how grateful he was just to have found employment during the economic recession, how determined he was to succeed despite his complete lack of industry experience. "I remember you," Delores continued, her voice carrying warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension that had characterized their interaction so far. "You were so eager to learn, so respectful to everyone you met, so hungry to understand every aspect of the business. You spent your lunch breaks in the staff cafeteria, asking questions about hotel operations. And you stayed late every night studying procedure manuals that most managers never bothered to read." Margaret Chen looked between the photograph and Maurice with obvious curiosity. "You started here as an entry-level employee." Maurice felt heat rising in his cheeks. His current biography, the one used in press releases and corporate materials, emphasized his MBA credentials and strategic vision, while glossing over the humble circumstances of his early career. "I was hired as a management trainee," he said carefully. "You were hired as a night auditor," Delores corrected gently but firmly. "Minimum wage, graveyard shift, because that was the only position available and you needed the job desperately. But you approached that work with such dedication and curiosity that people noticed." She pointed to the distinguished man in the photograph. "That's Mr. Harold Belmont, Mrs. Elizabeth's brother-in-law, who was managing the hotel's day-to-day operations at the time. He became your mentor because I recommended you to his attention." The revelation hit Maurice like a physical blow. Harold Belmont had been the most influential figure in his early career, the man who had taught him about leadership, strategy, and the hospitality industry's unique challenges. Maurice had always assumed that Harold had noticed his potential through his own merit and hard work. "I don't understand," David Rodriguez interjected. "How would a housekeeper be in a position to recommend someone to senior management?" Delores smiled with what might have been amusement. "Sir, housekeeping staff see everything in a hotel. We're invisible to most guests and managers, which means we observe without influencing behavior. We know who treats service staff with respect, who stays late to help with problems that aren't their responsibility, who takes pride in their work regardless of how menial it might seem." She looked directly at Maurice. "You were different from other management trainees we had seen. Most of them treated entry-level work as something to endure until they could move up to more prestigious positions. But you genuinely wanted to understand how everything worked, and you treated every employee with the same respect you showed to executives." Maurice felt himself transported back to those early days, when his ambition had been tempered by humility and his success had depended on building relationships rather than asserting authority. He remembered asking Delores for advice about guest complaints, seeking her input on scheduling issues, learning from her observations about operational efficiency. "I told Mr. Harold that you had the qualities the hotel industry really needed," Delores continued. "Intelligence, certainly, but also empathy, curiosity, and genuine respect for the people who make hospitality businesses actually work. He started giving you additional responsibilities because I vouched for your character. The board members were listening with obvious fascination to this unexpected history lesson. Maurice had built his reputation as a self-made executive who had risen through merit and strategic thinking. But Delores was revealing a more complex narrative about mentorship, recognition, and the importance of relationships in professional development. "Mr. Harold taught you well," Delores said, her voice carrying notes of both pride and sadness. "Under his guidance, you learned to balance business objectives with human values. You understood that treating employees well wasn't just morally right, it was also good business strategy. You knew that guest satisfaction depended on staff satisfaction, and that long-term success required building trust rather than just managing costs." Margaret Chen was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that this personal history might be relevant to understanding current management challenges. "What changed?" she asked bluntly. Delores sighed, and for the first time since entering the boardroom, she looked genuinely sad. "Mr. Harold passed away in 2015, just 2 years after you were promoted to general manager. The corporate acquisition happened 6 months later, and the new ownership structure brought different priorities and different pressures." She looked at Maurice with an expression that seemed almost maternal. "You were grieving the loss of your mentor and trying to prove yourself to new owners who measured success differently than the Belmont family had. The quarterly profit targets, the efficiency metrics, the pressure to show immediate results. It changed your approach to leadership." Maurice felt a complex mixture of emotions as these suppressed memories resurged. Harold Belmont had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure who had shaped Maurice's understanding of leadership and responsibility. His death had left Maurice feeling isolated and uncertain, vulnerable to the corporate pressures that came with the hotel's acquisition. "I remember the conversation we had after Mr. Harold's funeral," Delores continued quietly. "You were so worried about living up to his legacy, so determined to prove that his faith in you had been justified. But somewhere along the way, you started believing that proving yourself meant abandoning the values he had taught you." The photograph seemed to glow under the conference room's lights, a tangible reminder of the person Maurice had once been. Eager, humble, grateful for opportunities and guidance. The contrast with his current self was stark and uncomfortable. "You used to ask my opinion about operational changes," Delores said. "You understood that different perspectives could improve decision-making. You knew that the people who cleaned the rooms and served the meals often had insights that boardroom discussions might miss." David Rodriguez looked uncomfortable as he realized the implications of this history. "When did that consultation process end?" "Gradually," Delores replied. "As the pressure for cost reductions increased, efficiency became more important than effectiveness. Decisions started being made faster, with fewer people involved, based primarily on financial projections rather than operational reality." Maurice stared at the photograph and realized that the young man in that image would probably be horrified by the executive he had become. The person who had once valued every employee's contribution had evolved into someone who saw staff primarily as cost centers to be optimized. The termination letter was still in his hand, but now it felt less like a business document and more like evidence of how far he had strayed from the principles that had once guided his career. He was looking at proof of his own transformation from someone who had built success through relationships and respect into someone who pursued success regardless of its human cost. The weight of recognition was settling heavily on Maurice's shoulders when Delores reached beneath her uniform collar and withdrew a thin chain. Attached to it was a small key that opened a locker in the staff changing area, and from her expression, the board members could tell that she was about to share something even more significant than what she had already revealed. "If you'll permit me," Delores said with formal politeness, I'd like to retrieve something that might help explain my perspective on this situation. Without waiting for permission, she walked to the boardroom's phone and dialed an extension. Rosa, would you please bring me the brown leather journal from my locker? Use the small key that's hanging inside. Thank you, dear. Within minutes, a young Latina woman in a housekeeper's uniform appeared at the boardroom door, carrying a worn, leather-bound journal that had obviously seen decades of careful use. Rosa's eyes were wide with concern as she took in the unprecedented scene of Delores standing among the executive team. But she handed over the journal with the reverent care of someone who understood its importance. Thank you, Rosa, Delores said warmly. Please tell the others that everything is fine. After Rosa left, Delores placed the journal on the conference table with the same care she had shown the photograph and blueprints. The leather cover was rich brown, softened by age and handling, with pages that were clearly organized by date and subject matter. This contains my personal observations about the Grand Belmont's operations since 1993, she explained, opening to a section marked with a silk ribbon. Not just housekeeping issues, but guest interactions, operational improvements, and solutions to problems that official reports never captured. Margaret Chen leaned forward with obvious interest. What kind of observations specifically? Delores turned to a page marked December 2019 and began reading. Senator Catherine Morrison's security team was concerned about privacy during her 3-day stay for the Foreign Policy Conference. Standard protocol would have assigned her a corner suite with maximum distance from elevator traffic, but I suggested the 4th-floor diplomatic suite because I had noticed that sound carries differently in that section of the building due to the original acoustic design. She looked up at the board members. The senator's chief of staff was so impressed with our discretion and attention to detail that she recommended us to 4 other high-profile political figures. Those referrals generated approximately $200,000 in additional revenue that year. David Rodriguez was checking his tablet, cross-referencing dates and booking records. That's documented in our VIP guest database, he confirmed. How did you know about the acoustic properties of that suite? 30 years of paying attention, Delores replied simply. When you clean every room repeatedly, you notice things like which walls are thicker, which locations have less foot traffic, which areas provide natural privacy advantages. She turned to another marked page. In March 2018, the Thompson Industries Board was considering whether to hold their annual shareholder meeting here. They were concerned about our ability to handle complex audio-visual requirements for simultaneous translation. I suggested using the Astor Ballroom with a specific microphone configuration that would optimize sound distribution for their international attendees. Maurice felt compelled to interject. Those technical decisions are handled by our events team in consultation with professional audio-visual contractors. Delores nodded respectfully. Of course, sir. But I had observed similar events in that space and noticed that the room's original design included acoustic features that most modern contractors don't recognize. The Belmont family had incorporated elements specifically for large multilingual gatherings because they anticipated hosting international business events. She showed them a hand-drawn diagram in her journal illustrating optimal speaker placement based on the room's architectural properties. The sketch was remarkably detailed and technically sophisticated, suggesting knowledge that went well beyond typical housekeeping responsibilities. Margaret Chen studied the diagram with growing amazement. This shows understanding of acoustic engineering principles. Where did you learn this? For the first time since entering the boardroom, Delores looked slightly embarrassed. I have a bachelor's degree in architecture from Howard University, ma'am. I was working on my master's degree when my daughter was born and my husband left. I needed steady work with health insurance, so I put my career plans on hold temporarily. The revelation hit the board members like a thunderbolt. They had been condescending to someone with formal education in the exact field most relevant to hotel design and operation. Maurice felt his face burning with shame as he realized how completely he had misjudged the woman he had attempted to fire. Temporarily? David Rodriguez asked gently. Delores smiled with a mixture of resignation and acceptance. 30 years is longer than I expected, but raising a daughter as a single mother required priorities. The Grand Belmont provided stability and excellent benefits, and I found ways to use my education, even if my official title didn't reflect it. She turned to another section of the journal filled with technical sketches and improvement suggestions. I've documented hundreds of observations about traffic flow, space utilization, guest behavior patterns, and operational efficiency. Most of these insights come from combining my architectural training with 3 decades of practical experience. Margaret Chen was taking rapid notes, clearly recognizing the business value of this untapped expertise. Have any of these observations been implemented? Many of them indirectly, Delores replied. When I could find ways to suggest improvements through appropriate channels, some were adopted. The current layout of the fitness center, the traffic flow design for the restaurant, the storage optimization in guest room closets, all incorporated elements from my recommendations. Maurice felt his authority crumbling, as he realized that many operational improvements he had taken credit for had actually originated from suggestions by the woman he was trying to terminate. His strategic vision had been built on insights from someone whose potential he had never bothered to recognize. Why didn't you pursue advancement opportunities? David Rodriguez asked. With your qualifications, you could have moved into management positions. Dolores's expression became thoughtful. I applied for several positions over the years, sir. But hotel management tends to promote from operations departments like front desk and food service rather than housekeeping. My applications were usually acknowledged politely but not seriously considered. She paused, looking directly at Maurice. Also, after the corporate acquisition, advancement seemed to depend more on MBA credentials and quarterly performance metrics than on operational knowledge or guest service excellence. The implicit criticism stung because Maurice recognized its accuracy. He had consistently promoted executives who shared his business school background and management philosophy, while overlooking long-term employees who possessed deeper institutional knowledge. I want to share one more example, Delores said, turning to a recent entry in her journal. Last month, the Pemberton wedding reception had a crisis when their specialized dietary requirements weren't properly communicated to the kitchen staff. The bride's mother has severe food allergies, and the pre-planned menu would have sent her to the hospital. She showed them detailed notes about the solution she had implemented. I worked directly with the kitchen to create alternative preparations using ingredients I knew we had available, coordinated with the service staff to ensure proper presentation, and personally supervised the meal service to prevent cross-contamination. Margaret Chen looked up from her notes. What was the outcome? The family was so grateful that they booked our venue for their son's engagement party 6 months in advance, Delores replied. They also provided a recommendation letter that helped us secure 3 additional high-end wedding bookings. She closed the journal and looked around the room at faces that showed a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and recognition. I'm not sharing these examples to boast about my contributions, but to illustrate that the hotel's success has always depended on people who care about excellence, rather than just efficiency. Maurice stared at the termination letter in his hand and realized it represented something far more significant than a simple cost-cutting measure. He was looking at evidence of his own failure to recognize talent, to value wisdom, and to understand the true sources of the hotel's competitive advantage. The woman he had dismissed as an expendable cost center was actually a repository of institutional knowledge, operational expertise, and guest service excellence that no amount of corporate training could replicate. And he had been about to throw it all away for a modest reduction in quarterly labor costs. The boardroom had fallen into contemplative silence as the implications of Dolores's revelations settled over the assembled executives. Maurice still held the termination letter, but it had become increasingly meaningless with each passing revelation. He was beginning to understand that he had fundamentally misunderstood both Delores and the nature of the business he thought he controlled. Delores closed her leather journal and looked around the room with an expression that suggested she had saved the most important information for last. "There's something else I need to share with you," she said quietly. "Something that Mrs. Elizabeth Belmont entrusted to me before the family sold the hotel to your company." She reached into an inner pocket of her uniform that the board members were only now realizing contained more storage space than seemed physically possible. From this final pocket, she withdrew a manila envelope that was clearly old but had been carefully preserved. The envelope was sealed with red wax that bore the impression of the Belmont family crest, and across the front was written in elegant handwriting, "To be opened only if the Grand Belmont's founding principles are ever abandoned." Margaret Chen leaned forward with obvious curiosity and concern. "What is that document?" "Mrs. Belmont called it her husband's ethical will," Delores explained, holding the envelope so everyone could see the unbroken wax seal. "Mr. Jonathan Belmont, who founded this hotel in 1952, apparently had concerns about what might happen to his legacy if the business ever fell into the wrong hands." Maurice felt a chill of apprehension as he realized that this conversation was about to take another unexpected turn. "Mrs. Washington, I don't know what you're implying, but Langston Hospitality Group acquired the Grand Belmont through a completely legitimate transaction. We have clear legal title to this property." "Oh, I'm not questioning the legality of the acquisition," Delores replied with calm assurance. But Mrs. Belmont was concerned about something more important than legal ownership. She was worried about moral stewardship. David Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What exactly did Mrs. Belmont tell you about this document?" Delores held the envelope with obvious reverence. She said that her husband had built this hotel not just as a business, but as a legacy, a place that would demonstrate how treating people with dignity and respect could be both morally right and financially successful. He wanted to create something that would outlast his own lifetime and continue to serve as an example of ethical business practices. She paused, looking directly at Maurice. But he also understood that future owners might be tempted to prioritize short-term profits over long-term values. So he included provisions in his will that would activate if the hotel ever strayed too far from its founding principles. Margaret Chen, as chief financial officer, immediately grasped the potential implications. "What kind of provisions?" "I don't know the details," Delores admitted. "Mrs. Belmont said the envelope should only be opened if someone with authority and integrity determined that the hotel had lost its way. She entrusted it to me because she believed I would recognize when that moment had arrived." Maurice felt panic beginning to rise in his chest. "This is completely inappropriate. Whatever that document contains, it cannot possibly have any legal bearing on current operations. Our ownership is clear and uncontested." But even as he spoke, Maurice realized that his confidence was based on assumptions rather than complete knowledge. The acquisition of the Grand Belmont had been complex, involving multiple entities and decades of legal history. He had relied on corporate attorneys and due diligence reports, but he had never examined the original founding documents personally. Delores looked at him with an expression that seemed almost pitying. "Mr. Langston, I'm not trying to threaten your position or create legal problems. I'm trying to help you understand that running a successful business requires more than just financial management." She gestured around the boardroom with its expensive furnishings and commanding views. "This room represents power and authority, but it's disconnected from the heart of what makes this hotel successful. The real value of the Grand Belmont isn't in the marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It's in the relationships, the trust, the reputation for excellence that takes decades to build and can be destroyed in a few quarters of cost-cutting." David Rodriguez was studying the sealed envelope with obvious fascination. Mrs. Washington, what would it take for you to consider opening that document? Delores considered the question carefully before responding. The letter was to be opened if the hotel abandoned its founding principles. Mrs. Belmont specifically mentioned 3 concerns: treating employees as disposable resources, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term relationships, and losing respect for the dignity of every person who works here. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. I believe we've reached that point. When the CEO of a hotel tries to fire a 30-year employee without cause, in front of a board of directors for no reason other than cost reduction, that represents exactly the kind of abandonment of values that concerned the Belmont family. Maurice felt the walls of the boardroom closing in on him as he realized that his termination attempt had triggered something beyond his control or understanding. Even if that document contains some kind of historical guidance, it cannot possibly override our current legal authority to manage this business as we see fit. Perhaps not, Delores agreed quietly, but it might contain information that would be relevant to your decision-making process. Mrs. Belmont hinted that her husband had been more thoughtful about the long-term implications of his business choices than anyone realized. Margaret Chen was clearly struggling with the financial implications of this unexpected development. If there are unknown provisions related to the hotel's operation, we need to understand them. Our fiduciary responsibility to shareholders requires full knowledge of any factors that might affect business performance. David Rodriguez nodded in agreement. From an operational standpoint, we should also consider whether this document contains insights that could improve our management approach. If the founding family identified principles that contributed to long-term success, that information could be valuable regardless of any legal implications. Maurice realized that his board was turning against him, not out of disloyalty, but out of recognition that Delores possessed knowledge and wisdom that could benefit the business. The woman he had tried to dismiss was demonstrating leadership qualities that he had failed to recognize, and her calm dignity was making his aggressive approach look increasingly inappropriate. Mrs. Washington, Margaret Chen said formally, if you believe the circumstances warrant opening that document, I think this board should hear what it contains. Delores looked around the room one more time, as if giving everyone a final opportunity to reconsider. When no one objected, she carefully broke the wax seal and withdrew several pages of heavy paper covered in the same elegant handwriting that had marked the envelope. She read silently for several minutes, her expression growing more serious as she absorbed the contents. Finally, she looked up at the assembled board members with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. Mr. Jonathan Belmont was indeed more thoughtful than anyone realized, she said quietly. This document establishes a foundation that was designed to activate if the hotel ever fell under management that violated its core values. The foundation has the authority to review operational decisions and, if necessary, to assume control of the property to protect the legacy he intended to preserve. The silence that followed this revelation was complete and profound. Every person in the room understood that they were facing a situation that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the organization. Furthermore, Delores continued, the document names me as the Foundation's designated representative, with authority to make determinations about whether the hotel's management aligns with its founding principles. She folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. I didn't seek this responsibility, and I don't take it lightly. But I made a promise to Mrs. Belmont that I would protect this hotel's soul, and I intend to honor that commitment. Maurice stared at the woman he had tried to fire and realized that she held more power over his future than he had ever imagined. The termination letter in his hand was no longer a symbol of his executive authority. It was evidence of exactly the kind of callous management approach that could trigger the loss of everything he had worked to build. The revelation about the Foundation's existence had transformed the boardroom's atmosphere completely. What had begun as a routine termination meeting had evolved into something approaching a corporate coup, and Maurice felt his 15 years of careful career construction teetering on the edge of collapse. "This is preposterous," he declared, his voice rising with desperation that he could no longer entirely control. "You cannot seriously believe that some hidden Foundation document from 70 years ago can override legitimate corporate governance. Our legal team will challenge any attempt to interfere with established business operations." But even as he spoke, Maurice could see that his board members were taking Delores' claims seriously. Margaret Chen was making rapid notes about the potential legal and financial implications, while David Rodriguez was clearly reassessing everything he thought he knew about the hotel's operational structure. Delores remained completely calm in the face of Maurice's escalating panic. "Mr. Langston, I understand your concern, but I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not seeking to remove you from your position or to damage the business you've worked to build. I'm hoping we can find a way to align your management approach with the values that made this hotel successful in the first place." She stood and walked to the boardroom's windows, looking out at the city beyond with the contemplative air of someone who had spent decades observing the ebb and flow of corporate power. "Mrs. Belmont gave me this responsibility because she believed that someone needed to speak for the employees who built this hotel's reputation, the guests who trusted us with their most important events, and the community that depends on businesses to demonstrate that success and integrity can coexist." Margaret Chen looked up from her notes with obvious concern. "Mrs. Washington, what would it take to satisfy the Foundation's requirements? What changes would be necessary to align current operations with the founding principles?" Before Delores could answer, there was a soft knock on the boardroom door. David Rodriguez called for whoever it was to enter, and Rosa, the young housekeeper who had delivered the journal, appeared again, this time accompanied by several other hotel employees. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Rosa said nervously, "but when word spread about what was happening up here, people wanted to show their support for Mrs. Washington." Behind Rosa stood James, the veteran bellhop Maurice had noticed earlier, along with Carmen from the front desk, several housekeeping staff members, 2 maintenance workers, and 3 kitchen employees. Each of them carried what appeared to be a signed petition, and their presence represented a cross-section of the hotel's operational workforce. Maurice felt his authority draining away as he realized that his executive decision was being challenged not just by one rebellious employee, but by a significant portion of his workforce. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Business decisions are not made by committee, and certainly not by entry-level employees who don't understand the complexities of corporate management." James, the bellhop, stepped forward with the quiet dignity that seemed to characterize all of Delores' supporters. "Mr. Langston, with respect, we understand more than you might think. We see how guests respond to different management approaches. We know which policies actually improve service and which ones just reduce costs without adding value." He handed one of the petitions to Margaret Chen, who began reading it with obvious surprise. "This is a formal request for employee representation in management decisions affecting customer service and operational efficiency," she announced to the room. "It's signed by 67 employees, representing more than 40% of the hotel's workforce." David Rodriguez was studying his own copy of the petition with growing amazement. "These aren't complaints or demands for higher wages. They're specific suggestions for operational improvements, backed by detailed observations about guest behavior and service delivery." Carmen from the front desk spoke up, her voice trembling slightly with nervousness but strong with conviction. "Mrs. Washington taught us that our job isn't just to follow procedures, but to anticipate guest needs and solve problems before they become complaints. When management changes focus to efficiency over service, we lose the ability to provide the kind of experience that justifies our premium pricing," one of the maintenance workers added, She also taught us that preventing problems is more cost-effective than fixing them after they occur. But the new maintenance schedules prioritize short-term savings over long-term equipment preservation. Maurice watched this unexpected employee uprising with growing horror. These were people he barely knew individually, workers whose names he had never bothered to learn, speaking with knowledge and insight that challenged his fundamental assumptions about their capabilities and contributions. Delores had remained silent during the employee presentations, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. Mr. Langston, these employees represent the institutional knowledge that makes this hotel special. They're not asking for power or recognition. They're asking for the opportunity to contribute their expertise to decisions that affect their ability to serve guests. Effectively, she gestured toward the petitions that the board members were still reading. Every suggestion in those documents is based on practical experience and direct observation. These people know which policies work and which ones don't because they implement them every day and see the results firsthand. Margaret, Chen was clearly struggling with the implications of what she was reading. Some of these operational suggestions could significantly improve both efficiency and guest satisfaction. Why haven't these insights been incorporated into management planning? Maurice felt cornered by the question because the honest answer would expose his own failure to create effective communication channels between management and staff. Corporate decision-making requires broader perspective than individual observations can provide, he said defensively. We have data analysis and industry benchmarks that guide our strategic planning. James, the bellhop, responded with respectful but pointed disagreement. Sir, data analysis tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you why it happened or how to prevent problems in the future. Mrs. Washington taught us to observe patterns and understand causes, not just report symptoms. David Rodriguez was nodding as he continued reading through the employee suggestions. These recommendations show remarkable sophistication in understanding guest psychology and operational efficiency. This level of insight could be extremely valuable for strategic planning. Delores watched the interaction with satisfaction, but also with sadness at the recognition of lost opportunities. For 30 years, I've tried to bridge the gap between management vision and operational reality. I've seen how decisions made in boardrooms can have unintended consequences that are completely predictable if you understand how the hotel actually functions. She walked back to the conference table and placed her hand on the stack of documents she had shared, the photographs, blueprints, journal and foundation papers that told the story of the hotel's evolution and potential. All of this knowledge, all of these insights, all of this institutional wisdom was available to you, Mr. Langston, but you chose to see it as irrelevant to your management approach. Maurice felt the weight of that accusation because he knew it was accurate. He had consistently prioritized external expertise over internal knowledge, had valued credentials over experience, had trusted theoretical models over practical wisdom. The employees standing before him represented a resource he had completely failed to recognize or utilize. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice carrying defeat that was becoming harder to disguise. Delores looked at him with an expression that seemed almost maternal, disappointed but not without hope. "I want you to remember who you used to be. Mr. Langston, I want you to recall the young man who was eager to learn from everyone, who treated every employee with respect, who understood that success comes from building relationships rather than asserting authority." She picked up the faded photograph that showed his first day at the hotel and placed it directly in front of him. That person could have been a great leader in the hospitality industry. He understood that serving others was not a weakness but a strength, that listening was more important than commanding, that building people up was more profitable than tearing them down. The employees who had gathered in support of Delores watched this interaction with obvious hope, but also with the wariness of people who had been disappointed by management promises before. They were willing to give Maurice an opportunity to change, but they were also prepared to support alternative leadership if he proved incapable of growth. Maurice stared at the photograph and felt the full weight of his transformation from the idealistic young man he had once been into the corporate executive he had become. The distance between those two versions of himself seemed almost unbridgeable, but the faces around him suggested that redemption might still be possible if he could find the courage to change. Margaret. Chen broke the silence with a practical question that highlighted the urgency of the moment. If the Foundation has the authority Mrs. Washington described, what happens next? What process determines whether current management continues or changes? Delores consulted the Foundation documents again before responding. The Foundation's Board of Trustees includes representatives from the original Belmont family, the local community, and the hotel's long-term employees. They have the authority to review management performance and make recommendations for changes that would better align operations with the founding principles. She paused, looking directly at Maurice. But the document also allows for voluntary compliance if current management demonstrates genuine commitment to reform. The Foundation prefers redemption to removal, but it requires evidence of real change rather than just promises. Maurice realized he was facing the most important decision of his professional life. He could fight this challenge and potentially lose everything, or he could admit his mistakes and work to become the leader these people needed and deserved. The choice would define not just his career, but his character. Maurice sat heavily in his chair, the termination letter falling from his fingers to the polished conference table. The weight of 30 years of accumulated wisdom, dignity, and institutional memory pressed down on him as he faced the complete collapse of his understanding of leadership and success. His hand moved unconsciously to his wrist, where a simple silver watch caught the light from the boardroom's chandeliers. The watch had belonged to his father, a man who had worked for 43 years as a supervisor at a Detroit automotive plant, treating every worker with respect regardless of their position on the assembly line. Maurice had worn it every day since his father's death, but he realized now that he had forgotten the values it was meant to represent. "My father," Maurice said quietly, his voice barely audible in the suddenly intimate space of the boardroom, "would be ashamed of the man I've become." He looked at the faces surrounding him, board members who had trusted his leadership, employees who had hoped for his guidance, and Delores, whose quiet dignity had exposed the bankruptcy of his corporate philosophy. The young man in the faded photograph seemed like a stranger, someone whose idealism had been gradually eroded by quarterly reports and efficiency metrics. "When I started here," Maurice continued, his voice growing stronger but also more vulnerable, "I believed that success in business meant lifting everyone up together. I thought that treating people well wasn't just morally right, but strategically smart. I understood that a hotel's reputation depended on every single person who worked here caring about excellence." Delores listened with the patience of someone who had been waiting 15 years for this moment of recognition. "What changed your mind, Mr. Langston?" Maurice touched his father's watch again, remembering conversations from his youth about the dignity of honest work and the responsibility that came with authority. Pressure, competition, the constant demand to show improved results every quarter. Somewhere along the way, I started believing that being tough meant being callous, that being efficient meant being heartless. He looked directly at Delores. Seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, I convinced myself that personal relationships were a luxury that successful executives couldn't afford. I thought that emotional distance was a sign of professional maturity. Margaret Chen, who had spent the past hour reassessing everything she thought she knew about effective management, spoke with unusual gentleness. "Maurice, what would you do differently if you had the opportunity to start over?" The question hung in the air as Maurice contemplated the magnitude of the changes that would be required. "Everything," he said finally. "I would listen instead of commanding. I would ask questions instead of making assumptions. I would remember that every employee has knowledge and insights that could make the business better. He stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city where his father had once worked alongside people whose names he knew, whose families he cared about, whose dignity he protected even when corporate demands suggested that efficiency was more important than humanity. I would remember, Maurice continued, that the hotel business is fundamentally about service, not just serving guests, but serving the community, serving employees, serving a vision of what hospitality can be when it's done with integrity. David Rodriguez had been quietly observing this transformation, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare in corporate America, a genuine moment of moral reckoning. Maurice, if the board supported you in making those changes, would you be willing to implement them? Maurice turned back to face the room, his expression mixing hope with determination. I would be grateful for the opportunity, but I understand that trust, once broken, has to be earned back through actions rather than promises. Delores stood and approached Maurice with the careful grace of someone who understood the delicate nature of redemption. Mr. Langston, I don't want to see you fail. I want to see you succeed in a way that honors both your potential and the legacy of this hotel. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Maurice took it. The gesture was simple but profound, a handshake between two people who had found common ground, despite their very different perspectives on power and authority. But, Delores continued, her voice carrying gentle firmness, success will require more than good intentions. It will require fundamental changes in how decisions are made, how employees are valued, and how the hotel's mission is understood. Margaret Chen was already thinking through the practical implications. We would need to restructure our decision-making processes to include employee input. We would need to revise our performance metrics to balance efficiency with service quality. We would need to rebuild trust that has been damaged by previous management approaches. Maurice nodded, understanding that redemption would be measured not by his willingness to change, but by his ability to sustain that change over time. I'm ready to do whatever is necessary. The board members exchanged glances, recognizing that they were facing a moment that would define not just Maurice's future, but the character of their entire organization. The decision they made in the next few minutes would determine whether the Grand Belmont Hotel would continue down the path of corporate efficiency or return to the principles of dignity and service that had built its reputation. Delores looked around the room at faces that showed a mixture of hope, skepticism, and determination. The Foundation's requirements are clear, she said. Employee representation in operational decisions, commitment to long-term relationship building over short-term cost-cutting, and genuine respect for the dignity of every person who works here. She paused, giving everyone time to absorb the magnitude of what she was proposing. These aren't just idealistic principles, they're practical business strategies that built this hotel's success over decades. The question is whether current leadership has the wisdom and courage to embrace them again. Maurice took a deep breath and faced the assembled group, board members, employees, and Delores, with the kind of vulnerability that corporate executives were taught to avoid, but that true leadership sometimes required. I owe everyone in this room an apology, he began, his voice steady but filled with genuine remorse. He came into this meeting planning to fire one of the most valuable employees this hotel has ever had, based on nothing more than her salary and my own ignorance about her contributions. He picked up the termination letter and, in a gesture that would be remembered by everyone present, tore it in half. This document represents everything wrong with my approach to leadership. It reduces a human being with 30 years of dedication and wisdom to a line item on a spreadsheet. The employees who had gathered to support Delores watched this transformation with cautious hope, their expressions showing that they wanted to believe in change, but had been disappointed too many times to accept promises without evidence. Maurice continued, looking directly at Delores. Mrs. Washington, I'm not just asking you to stay. I'm asking you to help me rebuild this hotel into what it was meant to be. I'm asking you to share your knowledge, your wisdom, and your vision so that we can serve our guests and our community in ways that honor the legacy you've protected for 3 decades. Delores studied his face carefully, searching for signs of sincerity versus corporate calculation. Mr. Langston, what exactly are you proposing? Margaret Chen, who had been taking notes throughout the entire confrontation, spoke with the precision of someone who understood that good intentions needed structural support. We need to formalize a new leadership structure that includes employee representation and operational expertise in strategic decision-making. She looked around the room, making eye contact with both executives and staff. I propose that we create a new position, Director of Guest Experience and Employee Relations, with authority to review and modify operational policies that affect service quality or employee satisfaction. David Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. That position would have representation on the executive committee and veto power over changes that contradict the hotel's service standards or founding principles. Maurice realized that his board was not just supporting his redemption, but actively designing a structure that would prevent him from repeating his mistakes. Are you suggesting that Mrs. Washington should hold that position? I'm suggesting, Margaret Chen replied carefully, that whoever holds that position should have demonstrated commitment to the hotel's values, extensive operational knowledge, and the respect of both employees and management. Mrs. Washington seems uniquely qualified. Delores remained silent for several moments, clearly weighing the implications of accepting such a role. The other employees looked to her with obvious hope, recognizing that her acceptance would represent not just personal advancement, but systemic change that could benefit everyone. I would accept that responsibility, Delores said finally, but only with clear understanding about what it would mean. I wouldn't be interested in a ceremonial position that provides the appearance of change without actual authority. Maurice felt relief flooding through him as he realized that redemption was possible, but also trepidation as he understood that his authority would now be shared with someone whose values and priorities might challenge his comfortable assumptions. What would you need to make this partnership successful? He asked. Delores thought carefully before responding. Regular staff consultation on operational changes, transparent communication about financial pressures and strategic decisions, investment in employee development and recognition programs, and most importantly, commitment to measuring success by guest satisfaction and employee retention, not just quarterly profits. David Rodriguez was already drafting notes about implementation. We could restructure our performance metrics to include long-term indicators alongside short-term financial results. Guest loyalty, employee tenure, community reputation. These factors contribute to sustainable profitability, even if they don't show immediate returns. Margaret Chen was thinking through the financial implications. Actually, businesses that prioritize employee satisfaction and customer loyalty tend to outperform cost-focused competitors over time. We might discover that doing the right thing is also the most profitable thing. Maurice looked around the room at faces that showed cautious optimism mixed with determination. Then let's make this official, he said. Mrs. Washington, would you accept the position of Director of Guest Experience and Employee Relations, with full authority to ensure that our operations align with the hotel's founding principles? Delores stood and extended her hand again, this time in a gesture of partnership rather than reconciliation. I accept, Mr. Langston, but I want to be clear that this isn't about punishment or vindication. It's about building something better than what either of us could create alone. As they shook hands, the other employees began to smile for the first time since entering the boardroom. James, the veteran bellhop, started to applaud, and the sound was soon taken up by everyone in the room. Board members and housekeeping staff, united in recognition that they had witnessed something remarkable. Margaret Chen was already drafting the formal agreement that would restructure the hotel's leadership and establish new principles for decision-making. I suggest we schedule a company-wide meeting to announce these changes and explain the new structure. Maurice nodded, understanding that transparency would be essential to rebuilding trust. Mrs. Washington, would you be willing to co-present the announcement? I think the staff should hear about these changes from both of us. Delores smiled, the first genuine smile anyone in the room had seen from her that day. I think that would send exactly the right message about partnership and shared responsibility. As the immediate crisis resolved into the beginning of genuine reform, everyone in the room understood that they had participated in something that went beyond corporate restructuring. They had witnessed the transformation of conflict into collaboration, the replacement of autocracy with partnership, and the triumph of dignity over efficiency. The termination meeting had become a redemption story, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for a new approach to leadership that honored both business success and human values. 6 months later, the Grand Belmont Hotel hummed with an energy that longtime employees recognized but had almost forgotten. The morning staff meeting in the renovated conference room, smaller than the executive boardroom, but more welcoming, brought together representatives from every department to discuss the day's priorities and share insights about guest needs. Maurice sat at the round table alongside Delores, their partnership now so natural that new employees assumed it had always been this way. The rectangular table that had once symbolized corporate hierarchy had been replaced with a circular one that encouraged conversation rather than presentation. The change was symbolic, but it reflected a deeper transformation in how decisions were made and authority was shared. "Good morning, everyone," Maurice began, his tone carrying warmth that would have been unrecognizable to the executives who had witnessed his attempted termination of Delores 6 months earlier. "Rosa, I understand you have some observations about the guest satisfaction patterns from yesterday." Rosa, the young housekeeper who had once been intimidated by management meetings, now spoke with confidence, earned through months of being listened to and valued. "The families staying in the renovated suites are spending an average of 90 minutes longer in the lobby and restaurant areas. I think the connecting rooms and play area modifications are encouraging guests to use the hotel as a gathering place rather than just sleeping accommodation." Delores nodded approvingly. "That confirms the pattern we've been tracking. When families feel comfortable, they tend to purchase additional services and recommend us to other families." Rosa's observation helps us understand why our food and beverage revenue has increased 18% over the past quarter. Margaret Chen, who attended these morning meetings as both CFO and advocate for the new collaborative approach, added the financial context that helped everyone understand the business impact of their service improvements. The family suite modifications cost $80,000 to implement, but they've generated an additional $160,000 in revenue so far this year. James, the veteran bellhop, raised a point that illustrated how employee insights continued to drive operational improvements. "I've noticed that business travelers are asking for later checkout times more frequently. I think it's because they're using their rooms for morning conference calls now that the Wi-Fi reliability has improved." David Rodriguez made a note on his tablet. "Let's explore extending checkout options for verified business travelers." If James is seeing this pattern, it probably represents an unmet need we could address with minimal cost. Maurice watched this exchange with satisfaction that went beyond mere business success. The hotel's financial performance had indeed improved dramatically. Guest satisfaction scores were at historic highs, employee turnover had dropped to almost zero, and occupancy rates were exceeding industry averages. But the transformation went deeper than metrics could measure. After the meeting concluded and most staff members had returned to their duties, Maurice and Delores walked together through the hotel's public spaces, a routine they had established to maintain direct contact with operations and guests. Their partnership had evolved into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the hotel's mission. "You know," Maurice said, as they paused in the lobby near the Belmont family portrait that had taken on new significance over the past months, "I've been thinking about that conversation we had in the boardroom, about the difference between running a business and understanding a business." Delores smiled, following his gaze to the portrait of the founding family. "What conclusions have you reached?" "That success requires both," Maurice replied. "Financial discipline and strategic planning are essential, but they only work when they're built on genuine understanding of what creates value for guests and meaning for employees." They stopped at a display case that now held the employee charter they had developed together, a document that formalized the hotel's commitment to dignity, respect, and collaborative decision-making. The charter had been signed by every employee and posted in multiple locations throughout the hotel, serving as both policy and promise. "I've been reading some of the guest comment cards," Delores said, pulling a few from her pocket. "Listen to this one. The Grand Belmont feels like a place where people genuinely care about providing excellent service. Every employee we encountered seemed proud of their work and eager to help. That's the kind of reputation that takes years to build and generates loyalty money can't buy." Maurice took the comment card and read it again, recognizing that such feedback represented the culmination of everything they had worked to achieve. "My father would have understood this," he said quietly. "He always said that when people feel valued and respected, they do their best work naturally." Delores nodded, touching the brass key that still hung from her uniform chain. "Mrs. Belmont would have been proud too. She believed that businesses could be both profitable and principled, that success didn't require sacrificing values." As they completed their walk through the hotel, Maurice reflected on how completely his understanding of leadership had changed. The executive who had once measured success primarily through quarterly reports now recognized that sustainable profitability came from building relationships, developing people, and serving purposes larger than immediate financial returns. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some board members had initially resisted the new collaborative approach, worried that shared decision-making would slow response times and reduce efficiency. But the results spoke for themselves. The hotel was more profitable than ever, but also more humane, more sustainable, and more aligned with the values that had built its original reputation. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Delores said as they returned to the administrative offices. "The Foundation trustees reviewed our progress last month, and they're so pleased with the changes that they're considering the Grand Belmont as a model for other hospitality businesses." Maurice felt a complex mixture of pride and humility at this recognition. 6 months ago, he had been on the verge of losing everything because of his failure to understand what made the hotel special. Now that same hotel was being recognized as an example of how businesses could honor both financial success and human dignity. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your patience, your wisdom, and your willingness to give me a chance to become the leader this place deserved." Delores smiled with the warmth of someone who had found deep satisfaction in work that mattered. "Thank you for remembering who you were meant to be. The young man I recommended to Mr. Harold all those years ago just needed the right circumstances to emerge again." As afternoon settled over the Grand Belmont Hotel, its lobby filled with guests who had chosen this place not just for its luxury amenities, but for the intangible sense that they were welcomed by people who took genuine pride in service. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers remained as elegant as ever, but they now served as the backdrop for something more valuable, a business that demonstrated how treating people with dignity and respect could create success that enriched everyone it touched. The termination letter that had started everything was long since forgotten, replaced by partnership agreements, employee charters, and guest testimonials that told the story of transformation. But most importantly, it had been replaced by the daily practice of leadership that honored both the bottom line and the human spirit. proving that wisdom and dignity would always triumph over mere efficiency when given the chance to flourish.